Welcome to Tales of Warriors channel. Today, we will discover the riveting world of covert operations of the Israeli intelligence service, known as Mossad. This is a compelling stories collection, unveils the clandestine endeavors of Israel's renowned intelligence agency, delving into thrilling accounts of daring missions, strategic triumphs, and the remarkable individuals behind them. From Mossad's legendary exploits to lesser-known operations, this gripping narrative offers a captivating insight into the shadowy realm of espionage and national security. Join us on a journey through Mossad's daring covert operations. In this video, we will discover the first three operations that defined Israel's Secret Service legacy. This video is suitable for those who have free time, are ready for bed, driving, or need something as background while studying, cleaning, or relaxing. Episode 4. A Soviet mole and a body at sea. Zev Avni yearned to become a Mossad agent. As he arrived, one rainy day in April 1956, at Mossad headquarters, he was wishing with all his heart to come out of there as an employee of the Mossad. For years he had been trying to become one of the selected few, and this had been his most important goal in life. Born Wolf Goldstein in Riga, Latvia, he had grown up in Switzerland, served in the Swiss Army during World War II, and immigrated to Israel in 1948. He had changed his name to the Hebrew Zev Avni, and after a couple of years of living and working at Kibbutz Hazariah, he had joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and was posted in Brussels. Personable, well-read, fluent in several languages, he had charmed his superiors with his manners and diligence as well as with his willingness to volunteer for any chore, especially those connected with the Mossad. Whenever a diplomat was needed for a secret courier job, for an urgent trip to another city, for delivering classified documents to a Mossad undercover unit anywhere in Europe, Avni was the first to volunteer. His frequent cooperation with the Mossad informally made him one of their guys in Europe, and that collaboration became more intense when he was transferred to Israel's embassy in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. In several letters to the Ramsad, Issa Horel, Avni suggested establishing a Mossad station in Belgrade. Horel refused. The Mossad had no need for a station in Yugoslavia, but Avni didn't give up. In April 1956, he came back to Israel on a private visit and asked to see the Ramsad. His demand was granted, and that day he was to meet Issa Horel for the first time. Tense and nervous, he entered Horel's office in an old house in the former German colony in Tel Aviv. Horel had been appointed Ramsad less than 4 years earlier, but was already a legend. People admired and feared this short, enigmatic man. True and false stories about him wafted through the dim Mossad corridors. Avni had heard bits and pieces about Horel, who had been nicknamed Little Issa, to tell him apart from the notorious Big Issa. Avni feared this encounter, given the rumors about Little Issa's stubbornness, his brusque manners, and fantastic intuition. But the short, lean, and balding man in khakis and a short-sleeved shirt who received Avni in his monastic office was soft-spoken and kind. He admitted to being impressed by Avni's demeanor and political savvy. He asked Avni for the reason of his visit to Israel right now, and Avni explained that his daughter from his first marriage had demanded that he come to see her. "How old is your daughter?" Issa asked, smiling. 8. 8? Issa looked surprised. He seemed to find it odd that a diplomat would rush home from abroad just because his little daughter had summoned him. Avni then went into a detailed explanation about his complex relationship with his first wife, his child, and his current wife. Issa grew impatient, cut him short, and told him that there would be no Mossad station in Belgrade. As for Avni's future, he said, "We'll see after you complete your tour of duty in Yugoslavia." Avni felt crushed. However, before he left, Issa offered to meet with him again, in a couple of days, but not in this building, too many people come in and out. You'll meet me in my secret downtown office, my driver will take you there. There was still hope, Avni thought. If not, why would Issa want to see him again? A few days later, Avni walked into a nondescript apartment in central Tel Aviv. He had no reason to fear Issa anymore. After all, he had been friendly at their first meeting. Issa was waiting for him and led him into a big room, bare walls, a desk, a couple of chairs, shuttered windows. Avni sat down and Issa suddenly metamorphosed into a raging bull. His face contorted, he banged his fists on the desk and roared, "You are a Soviet agent! Confess! Confess! And again, confess!" He kept hammering his clenched fists on his desk and shouting, "I know the Soviets sent you. I know you're a spy. Confess!" Avni, thunderstruck, froze. He felt unable to say a word. "Confess! If you cooperate with me, I'll try to help you, but if not..." Avni's heart pounded madly in his chest. He was covered in cold sweat and his tongue felt like lead. He was certain that his last moment had come and Issa would have him killed. He finally gathered up the strength to utter a few words. "I confess," he mumbled, "I work for the Russians." Issa opened a concealed door, and in walked two of his best agents and a police officer. The officer arrested Avni, and he was taken away to an interrogation facility. Then, step by step, he revealed his identity and his true aim. A fervent communist since his teens, he had been recruited by the Soviet GRU, the Red Army Espionage Service, while still living in Switzerland, and had spied for the Soviet Union during World War II. Shortly after, he had been advised to immigrate to Israel and wait. He was to become a long-term mole. For many years, he had expected a message from Moscow, but the Russian master spies had waited to contact him only when he had been posted to Brussels. There, he delivered to them important information about Israel's deals with the F.N arms industry in Belgium, had supplied them with the Israeli Foreign Ministry codes, and even revealed to them the names of two German ex-Nazis who were spying for Israel in Egypt. To the surprise of their handlers, the two Germans had been hastily expelled from Egypt. But that had not been enough for Avni's Russian case officers. They wanted their man to infiltrate the Mossad. And that's what Avni tried so hard to do, until the moment when Issa shouted, "Confess!" And when he confessed, he didn't know what was most shocking. He could have walked out of Issa's trap a free man. The Ramsad hadn't the slightest shred of evidence against him, only suspicions, not even a hint of proof that Avni was a spy. True, long ago, somebody had mentioned to Issa that Avni had been expelled from his kibbutz because of his communist views. But a Soviet spy? Issa had acted on intuition alone. Avni's relentless efforts to join the Mossad, the seemingly strange visit to his daughter, his attempts to convince Issa to establish a Mossad station in Belgrade. All these minor occurrences merged in Issa's sharp mind and led him to an unlikely conclusion: a mole, a traitor, had almost penetrated Israel's sanctum sanctorum. At his trial, Avni made a full confession and was sentenced to 14 years in prison. He was paroled after 9, became a model citizen and a psychologist. Issa told his biographer that Avni was the most dangerous spy ever caught in Israel, but also the most charming, and spoke warmly of him as the gentleman spy. Avni himself told us that over the years some of the high-ranking police officers and Shabak, rough equivalent of the American FBI, interrogators had become his good friends. Operation Pygmalion, as the Avni affair was called, for many years was one of the closest guarded secrets of the Mossad. But for the few who were in the know, it was one more proof of Issa's amazing instincts. But who was little Issa? Taciturn, shy, stubborn as a mule, he purportedly had been born in the ancient fortress town of Dvinsk, in Imperial Russia. It was said that when he immigrated to Israel at 18, he was carrying in his knapsack a loaf of bread, inside of which he had baked a revolver. Little Issa first settled in Kibbutz Shephaim, where he married a joyful horsewoman, Rivka. Tough, stubborn, and assertive, he left the kibbutz for unknown reasons with a wife, a child, and only the shirt on his back. During World War II, he joined the Haganah and soon became head of the Shai's Jewish department, which tracked traitors and dissidents. The dissidents were members of the Irgun and the Stern Group, two clandestine right-wing organizations that contested the authority and the politics of David Ben-Gurion and of the organized Jewish community. After the demise of Big Issa, Little Issa became head of the Internal Security Service, the Shabak. The Mossad had barely started functioning when Ben-Gurion, in a sudden move, accepted Reuven Shiloah's resignation and appointed Issa head of the Mossad. The official reason for the change was a traffic accident that was said to have incapacitated Shiloah, but the Mossad gossip was that Issa had bullied Shiloah out, after convincing Ben-Gurion that the Ramsad was erudite and a nice guy but unable to lead tough agents and carry out secret operations. Under Issa, the intelligence community acquired what became its definitive shape. It was composed of 5 services: the Mossad, the Shabak, the Aman, in military intelligence, the special branch of the police, and the research division of the foreign ministry. Of these, only Mossad, Aman, and Shabak were important, the other 2 were not as highly regarded. The directors of the 5 services and their deputies formed the Heads of Services Committee. Issa was appointed its chairman. Ben-Gurion also created a special title for him, Imimana, chief executive in charge of the security services. When he first appointed Little Issa to this new position, Ben-Gurion remarked, "Of course you'll continue to direct the Shabak, even though you now have Mossad." Issa selected a new Shabak director, though the overall control of both Mossad and Shabak remained in his hands. Thus, Little Issa became Israel's intelligence tsar. The Pygmalion affair was but one of several key operations Issa directed in the first years of Israel's existence, mostly against Soviet spies, many of whom were captured, jailed, or expelled. But not all spies worked for the Soviets, and not every spy story had a happy ending. One afternoon in early December 1954, a lone cargo aircraft kept circling over the eastern Mediterranean. When its pilots had made sure there were no seagoing vessels in the area, one of the aircraft doors opened and a big object was dropped into the sea, a body. The plane turned back and, an hour later, landed in Israel, marking the end of Operation Engineer, not its real name, an operation that remained ultra-confidential for more than 50 years. In 1949, 3 brothers from a Jewish family in Bulgaria arrived in Haifa. The oldest, Alexander Israel, had just graduated from the engineering school in Sofia. He enlisted in the army, was given the rank of captain, and was posted to the Israeli Navy. Captain Israel was a handsome and extremely charming young man. He was valued by his superiors and was assigned to top-secret research in electronic warfare and development of new weapons. Given a high-security clearance, he had access to some of the most sensitive material. He changed his first name to the Hebrew Avner, and in 1953 he married Matilda Ardaiti, a pretty, young woman of Turkish origin. The young couple settled in Haifa, close to Israel's major naval base. Matilda was very much in love with her charismatic husband, but unaware of the less delightful aspects of his personality. She didn't know that he had a long and colorful police record. Avner Israel had been accused of simultaneously leasing the same apartment to more than one renter, of posing as a refrigerator company representative who collected down payments for refrigerators that were not delivered, and of other such dealings. One case came to court, and he was summoned to report for trial on November 8, 1954. Matilda, heavy with child, knew nothing of her husband's fraud, nor of his affair with a pretty clerk at the Italian consulate in Haifa. Avner even proposed, and the Italian girl agreed on one condition: he must first convert to Catholicism. For young Avner this posed no great problem. He already had converted once before, in Bulgaria, when he was forced to marry another Christian girl whom he had seduced. Her furious family had demanded, almost at gunpoint, that he convert and marry the young woman. Right after the wedding he fled from Sofia, his wife committed suicide, and then he returned to Sofia and to Judaism. Now he did it again. He traveled to Jerusalem with his paramour, was baptized in the Terra Santa convent, and changed his name to Ivor. Using documents provided by the church, the charming captain registered with the Ministry of Interior and was issued a passport in his new name, Alexander Ivor. He and his Italian girlfriend set November 7, 1954, as the date for their wedding. The trial in Haifa was set for November 8. Avner Israel, aka Alexander Ivor, had no intention of honoring any of those commitments. The time had come for him to vanish. At the end of October, Captain Israel went on a 2-week leave. He had no exit visa, but Alexander Ivor had one, and a full set of documents, some authentic, others fake. He bought a plane ticket to Rome, and on November 4 he left. Neither his wife nor his fiancée knew about his departure. Her fiancé gone, the Italian woman started an anxious search. Finally, she turned to the Haifa police. With their help she discovered his address, where she was shocked to meet Mrs. Matilda Israel, in her 7th month of pregnancy. In Rome Avner Israel vanished, but not for long. The Mossad resident agent there had good sources in the Arab diplomatic community in Italy. On November 17 an urgent cable reached Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv. An Israeli officer, Alexander Ivor or Ivan or Ivy, is here, and is trying to sell military information to the Egyptian military attaché. The Ramsad and the new head of Shabak, Amos Manna, joined forces to find out who this was. In a few days they discovered his identity, and were dismayed to learn that he was an Israeli naval officer. Another telegram from Rome was even more troubling. The Mossad agent reported that Israel had sold the Egyptians the detailed plans of a large IDF base in Israel, and had been paid $1,500, which he had deposited in the Credit Suisse bank. He was said to have promised the Egyptians more information, and agreed to fly to Egypt, to be debriefed there. A few days later, another cable. The Egyptian embassy has ordered 2 tickets to Cairo for the end of November, at the TWA agency. Apparently, the 2 passengers will be the Egyptian military attaché and the Israeli officer. Alarm bells rang at Mossad headquarters. To Issa, there was a huge difference between a debriefing of an informant by a military attaché in a foreign country, and the transfer of that same informant to Egypt's capital, where he would be interrogated by experts, who would obtain even more detailed and dangerous information from him. Issa was determined to prevent, at all costs, the flight of Avner Israel to Cairo. He decided to dispatch his operational team to Rome. At these early days, the Mossad didn't have an operations department yet and used the operational unit of the Shabak. Its commander, one of the best agents Israel had, was a legend to his men, Rofi Eitan. Born on a kibbutz, he was a stubby, bespectacled, jolly little fellow, but also daring, creative, and ruthless. A Palmach fighter in the years preceding independence, he had been deeply involved in Aliyah Beth, the secret organization that smuggled Jews to Palestine despite the British restrictions. They had to escape from Europe on ramshackle boats, evade British warships cruising the shores of Palestine, land at deserted beaches, and then blend into the local Jewish population. Rofi's most famous exploit had been to blow up the British radar installation on Mount Carmel, near Haifa, which detected the approach of Aliyah Beth vessels. To reach the radar, Rofi had crawled through repulsive sewers and got himself named Rofi the Smelly. His future activities during the War of Independence confirmed his bravery and his wily intelligence. When Issa assembled his operational team, he recruited people with varying backgrounds: Holocaust survivors, Palmach and Haganah veterans, former members of the Irgun and the Stern Group, right-wing militants whom he had hunted during the pre-state struggle. One of the Mossad recruits was Yitzhak Shamir, a former leader of the Stern Group and a future prime minister. Rofi was appointed head of the operational team. He took off for Rome, together with agents Raphael Medon and Emmanuel Emma Talmor. Other agents joined them soon after. They immediately set up an ambush at Rome's Fiumicino airport. At the last briefing before their departure, Issa had ordered them to stop Avner Israel at the airport. He must never get on that plane. Fake a brawl, overpower him, and wound him if need be. And if all other moves fail, shoot and kill him. That was the first time ever that a license to kill was given to Israeli agents. But the airport attack didn't happen. The information about the trip to Egypt appeared erroneous. Israel stayed on in Rome a while, and then, suddenly, left and started traveling across Europe, with Eitan's team on his heels. As if trying to shake those who were chasing him, he went to Zurich, Geneva, Genoa, Paris, Vienna. And then, all of a sudden, Captain Israel vanished. The Mossad agents looked for him everywhere, but failed. But then, Rofi Eitan's usual luck came through. In Vienna, there was an Israeli envoy of a secret organization, Native, whose mission was to expedite the flight of Jews from Russia and the Eastern Bloc, and bring them to Israel. The Native man maintained close ties with the Mossad. One day in December, his Bulgarian-born wife had a surprise for him. "You won't believe this," she said, beaming. "This morning I was walking on the street, and I bumped into a friend of mine from Sofia. I hadn't seen him for years. We went to school together, in the same class. What a coincidence, don't you think?" "Really? What's his name?" the husband asked. "Alexander Israel. We're meeting tomorrow for lunch." The Native envoy knew of Eitan's search for a man who corresponded to his wife's description and alerted him right away. The following day, two Mossad agents went for lunch to the same restaurant and sat not far from where Alexander Israel and his childhood friend were reminiscing. When Israel left the Native man's wife, they clung to him like shadows. A few days later, Alexander Ivor boarded an Austrian Airlines plane to Paris. In the seat next to his was a young and attractive woman. Ivor, a consummate womanizer, started a conversation with her, and she pleasantly responded. They decided to meet again in Paris for a night on the town. Just before landing, she turned to the officer, "Some friends of mine are meeting me at the airport. Would you like to join us? I'm sure there'll be room in the car." Ivor was delighted. At the airport, two well-dressed gentlemen were waiting for the lady. The four of them got into a car and headed for Paris. Ivor sat beside the driver. Night had fallen, the driver noticed a man standing by a poorly illuminated crossroad and waving, as if trying to hitch a ride. "Let's take him," he said. He stopped the car, and suddenly the hitchhiker and a few other men, emerging from the darkness, converged on the vehicle, while another automobile stopped behind them. "We are being abducted!" Ivor shouted. Suddenly the man behind him grabbed him by the throat. Ivor struggled frantically against the grip of his attacker. The car door opened and the man standing outside jumped on Ivor and overpowered him. He drew a gun and shouted in Hebrew, "Another move, and you're dead." Ivor froze. A hand, holding a chloroform-soaked pad, was slapped on his face, and Ivor sank into deep sleep. He was surreptitiously brought to a safe house in Paris, where Rafi Eitan and his men interrogated him. He admitted that he had sold top-secret documents to the Egyptians, and that he had done it for the money. From Israel, Issa telegraphed an order to bring him back. Even the basest traitor, he believed, should stand trial, and his legal rights be respected. Eitan and his men drugged Avner, put him in a large crate, and loaded him on an Israeli Air Force Dakota cargo aircraft that used to fly once a week from Paris to Tel Aviv. The road home was long and strenuous. The plane had to refuel in Rome and Athens. A well-known doctor, an anesthetist by the name of Yona Elian, flew with the group. Before each landing and takeoff, the doctor would inject their passenger with a soporific drug. After the Athens takeoff, however, disaster struck. Avner Israel, unconscious, suddenly started breathing heavily, his pulse accelerated and his heartbeat became irregular. Dr. Elian made feverish efforts to stabilize him and bring his fit under control, including trying to revive the convulsing man with artificial respiration, but to no avail. Long before the plane landed in Israel, the prisoner died. Immediately after the landing, the Mossad agents called Issa and informed him of Israel's death. The Ramsad ordered them to leave the body on the plane and told the pilot to take off again. Far from Israel's coast, the body was thrown from the aircraft. This unexpected mishap led to a commotion at Mossad headquarters. Issa hurried to Prime Minister Moshe Sheret's office and asked him to appoint a board of inquiry to investigate the officer's death. Sheret appointed a two-man board, which cleared the Mossad agents from all wrongdoing. All they had done, the board ruled, was to bring the man to trial. They were not to blame for his death. The main reason for the death, they concluded, was apparently an overdose of the soporific that the doctor had injected. When asked years later, the doctor maintained that the death had been caused by abrupt changes in air pressure within the aircraft. In 1960 he participated, once again as anesthetist, in Eichmann's capture in Argentina. Issa's men checked Avner Israel's papers and discovered affidavits and letters of recommendation from the Catholic Church in Jerusalem. After selling his secrets to the Egyptians, he had planned to escape to South America. In his bags the agents found a ship ticket to Brazil. The next problem Issa had to face was with Israel's family. He should have invited Matilda to come in and tell her the whole truth. But the Mossad heads, embarrassed by the sorry end of the affair, preferred to bury the story and got the full support of Prime Minister Sheret. The Mossad leaked fabricated stories about Captain Avner Israel to the newspapers. They hinted that he had escaped from Israel after becoming entangled in personal debts and romantic affairs. These stories made fat headlines in the papers. For many years, Matilda, her husband's brothers, and her son, Moshe Israel Ivor, didn't know what had happened. They believed he was still living somewhere, maybe South America. That lie was unforgivable. The first failure of this mission was the way they treated Israel, even though he was a traitor. The second was their conspiracy of silence, the expunging of Israel's name from military records, the Mossad's misleading of his wife and brothers. Rafi Eitan and several Mossad officers strongly objected to the Ramsad's decision to throw the body in the sea and deceive the family, but their hands were tied. Little Issa was Mr. Security those days, Eitan told us. He was the absolute ruler of the secret services, and the intelligence community never disputed his decisions. The publication of this story, years later, demonstrates how difficult it is to obliterate the existence of a person. Even after they're dead, they sometimes talk to us from beyond the grave. Episode 5. Oh, that? It's Khrushchev's speech. It all started with a love affair. In the spring of 1956, Lucia Baranovsky was head over heels in love with a handsome journalist, Viktor Grajewski. Her marriage to the Deputy Prime Minister of Communist Poland was on the rocks, and they hardly saw each other anymore. Lucia worked as a secretary to Edward Achab, Secretary General of the Polish Communist Party. The members of his staff had grown accustomed to charming Viktor's frequent visits to his lovely girlfriend. There were no secrets about Lucia's feelings for this dashing young man. Viktor was a senior editor at the Polish news agency, PAP, in charge of Soviet and Eastern European affairs. He was actually Jewish, and his real name was Viktor Szpilman. But years ago, when he had joined the Communist Party, his friends had let him know that with a name like Szpilman he wouldn't get far. So he changed it to Grajewski, which sounded Polish. When the German army invaded Poland in World War II, he was a child. His family had managed to cross into Russia and narrowly escaped the Holocaust. After the war, they came back to Poland. In 1949, Viktor's parents and younger sister emigrated to Israel. But he, a staunch and ardent communist, stayed behind, Stalin's admirer. He longed to help create a workers' paradise. But neither his friends and colleagues, nor even his beloved, knew that disenchantment had started gnawing at the young communist's heart. In 1955 he visited his family in Israel, and saw another world, free, progressive, a Jewish democratic nation, a dream of sorts, utterly different from the communist propaganda he had been exposed to. Back in Poland, 30-year-old Viktor began to consider emigrating to Israel. That morning in early April 1956, Viktor came, as usual, to visit his sweetheart at the party secretary's office. On a corner of her desk, he saw a brochure bound in a red cover, numbered, and stamped with the inscription, "Top Secret." "What is this?" he asked her. "Oh, that's just Khrushchev's speech," she answered casually. Viktor froze. He had heard about Khrushchev's speech, but had never met anybody who had heard or read a single sentence from it. It was one of the best-kept secrets of the communist bloc. Viktor did know that Nikita Khrushchev, the almighty Secretary General of the Soviet Communist Party, had delivered the speech at the party's 20th Congress that had taken place the previous February at the Kremlin. On February 25, shortly before midnight, all foreign guests and heads of foreign communist parties were asked to leave the hall. At midnight, Khrushchev took the podium and spoke to the 1,400 Soviet delegates. His speech was said to be a surprise and a terrible shock for everyone present. But what had he said? According to an American journalist who dispatched a first report to the West, the speech had lasted for 4 hours, and Khrushchev had described in detail the terrible crimes of the man worshipped by millions of communists all over the world, Stalin. Khrushchev, rumor had it, had accused Stalin of the massacre of millions. Some whispered that while listening to the speech many delegates cried and pulled out their hair in despair, some fainted or suffered heart attacks, at least 2 committed suicides after that night. But not a word about Khrushchev's revelations was published by the Soviet media. Rumors wafted about Moscow, and some passages of the speech were read in closed sessions of the party's supreme bodies. But the full text of the speech was guarded, as if it were a state secret. Foreign reporters had told Victor that the Western secret services were mounting an all-out effort to obtain the text. The CIA had even offered a $1 million award. It was estimated that the publication of the text, at the height of the Cold War between the West and the Soviet bloc, could generate a political earthquake in the communist countries and trigger an unprecedented crisis. Hundreds of millions of communists, inside and outside Russia, blindly worshipped Stalin. The exposure of his crimes could destroy their faith and perhaps even cause the collapse of the Soviet Union. But all the efforts to get the speech failed. It remained an enigma. Lately, Victor had learned that Khrushchev had decided to send a few numbered copies to Communist Party leaders in Eastern Europe, which was how that brochure, bound in red, had reached Lucia's desk. When Viktor Gruevsky spotted it, he had a crazy idea. He asked Lucia to lend it to him for a couple of hours, so he could read it at home, without all the hustle-bustle in this office. To his surprise, she agreed. She was happy to please him. "You can take it," she said, "but you must bring it back before 4 p.m. I have to lock it in the safe." At home, Victor read the speech. It was indeed stunning. Khrushchev had shattered, boldly and mercilessly, the myth of Iosif Vissarionovich Stalin. Khrushchev had revealed that Stalin, during his years in power, had committed monstrous crimes and ordered the murder of millions. He'd reminded his audience that Lenin, the father of the Bolshevik Revolution, had warned the party against Stalin. Khrushchev condemned the cult of personality of the man who'd been hailed as the son of the nations. He told of the forced relocation of entire ethnic groups in the Soviet Union, which led to countless deaths, of the Great Purges, 1936 to 1937, when 1.5 million communists were arrested and 680,000 of them executed. Out of 1,966 delegates to the 17th Congress of the party, on Stalin's orders 848 were executed, as well as 98 out of 138 candidates to the Central Committee. Khrushchev also spoke of the doctors' plot, the fabricated accusations against some Jewish doctors who allegedly had conspired to murder Stalin and other Soviet leaders. Khrushchev's words revealed Stalin as a mass murderer who had massacred millions of Russians and other nationals, many of them loyal communists. In 4 hours, the Messiah had metamorphosed into a monster. Khrushchev's speech shredded Victor's last illusions about communism. And he realized that he held in his hands an explosive device that could shake the Soviet camp to its foundations. He decided to return the red brochure to Lucia. But on his way to her, he had second thoughts, and his feet carried him elsewhere, to the Israeli embassy. He walked in confidently, and the wall of Polish policemen and Secret Service agents parted and let him pass. A few minutes later, he was in the office of Yakov Barma, officially a first secretary of the embassy, but in reality, the Shabak representative in Poland. Gruevsky handed him the red brochure. The Israeli perused it and his jaw dropped. "Will you wait a few minutes?" he asked, grabbed the brochure, and left the room. He came back an hour later. Gruevsky realized that Barma had photocopied it, but asked no questions. He picked it up, concealed it under his coat, and left. He reached Lucia's office on time, and she put it in the safe. Nobody bothered him or asked him about his impromptu visit to the Israeli embassy. On Friday, April 13, 1956, In the early afternoon, Zelig Katz entered the office of the director of Shabak, Amos Manor. Katz was Manor's personal assistant. Shabak headquarters were located in an old Arab building in Jaffa, not far from the picturesque flea market. Manor asked Katz the routine Friday question, any material from Eastern Europe? Friday was the day when the diplomatic pouch brought reports from Shabak agents behind the Iron Curtain. Zelig nonchalantly quipped that a few minutes ago he had received from Warsaw some speech of Khrushchev at the Congress. Manor jumped from his seat. "What?" he roared. "Bring it at once." Manor, a tall, handsome young man, had immigrated to Israel only a few years earlier. Born Arthur Mendelovich in Romania, to a well-to-do family, he was sent to Auschwitz, where his entire family, parents, sister, and 2 brothers, were murdered. He survived, weighing barely 80 pounds when the camp was liberated. Back in Bucharest, he worked for Aliyah Beth, helping smuggle Jewish refugees into British-controlled Palestine. He used the war name of Amos, and several other names, to cover his tracks. When his turn came to leave for Israel, in 1949, the Romanian authorities wouldn't let him go. He managed to escape with a forged Czech passport in the name of Otto Stanek. His friends started calling him the man with 1,000 names. In Israel, he became Amos Manor. He rose quickly in the secret services. Issa was fascinated by him. Manor was his opposite. Issa small, Manor big. Issa tough and gruff, Amos suave and urbane. Issa played no sport, while Manor was a swimmer, and played soccer, tennis, volleyball. Issa spoke Russian and Yiddish, Manor spoke 7 languages. Issa was a devoted Labour Party member, Amos didn't care about politics. Issa dressed modestly, Amos was fashionable, European-looking. But besides all that, he was intelligent and resourceful. Issa recruited him to the Shabak in 1949. Barely 4 years later, he was appointed director by Ben-Gurion on Issa's recommendation. He also was put in charge of the Israeli intelligence community's secret relations with the CIA. On that rainy Friday, Manor threw himself into the sheaf of photocopied papers. He had no problems reading it. One of his 7 languages was Russian. Reading the pages, he realized the huge importance of Khrushchev's speech. He jumped into his car and rushed to Ben-Gurion's house. "You must read this," he told the Prime Minister. Ben-Gurion, who also knew Russian, read the speech. The following morning, a Sabbath, he summoned Manor urgently. "This is a historic document," he said, "and it all but proves that in the future Russia will become a democratic nation." Issa got the speech on April 15th, and right away saw that it could be a bonanza for Israel. In it was the means to upgrade the Mossad's ties with the CIA, first established in 1947. In 1951, when visiting the United States, Ben-Gurion had called on General Walter Bedell Smith, whom he had met in Europe at the end of World War II. Bedell Smith was the director of the CIA, and about to be replaced by Allen Dulles, an OSS veteran and brother of a future Secretary of State. Bedell Smith agreed, hesitantly, to establish limited cooperation between the CIA and the Mossad. The main element of such cooperation was the debriefing by the Israelis of Soviet and Eastern Bloc emigrants. Many were engineers, technicians, and even army officers who had worked in Soviet or Warsaw Pact installations and were able to supply detailed information about the capacities of the Communist bloc's armies. This information was regularly conveyed and it impressed the Americans. The CIA appointed as liaison with Israel a legendary figure, James Jesus Angleton, the head of CIA counterintelligence. Angleton visited Israel and came to know the heads of its services. He established a friendly rapport with Amos Manor and even spent a few nights in his tiny two-room apartment over bottles of scotch. But this time Issa and Amos offered far more than emigrants debriefings. They decided to hand over Khrushchev's speech to the Americans, not via the CIA man in Tel Aviv, but directly in Washington. Manor dispatched a copy of the speech with a special courier to Isidoro, the Mossad representative in the United States, who rushed to Langley and handed it to Angleton. On April 17, Angleton brought the speech to Allen Dulles, and later that day it was on President Eisenhower's desk. The American intelligence experts were stunned. Israel's tiny spy services had obtained what the giant, sophisticated services of the United States, Britain, and France couldn't get. Skeptical, CIA senior staff had the document examined by experts, who unanimously concluded it was genuine. Based on that, the CIA leaked it to the New York Times, which published it on its front page on June 5, 1956. Its publication caused an earthquake of sorts in the communist world, and prompted millions to turn their backs on the Soviet Union. Some historians hold that the spontaneous uprisings against the Soviets in Poland and Hungary, in the fall of 1956, were motivated by Khrushchev's revelations. The intelligence coup led to a major breakthrough in the Mossad's relations with its American counterpart, and the modest brochure that sweet Lucia had shown to her handsome Victor had surrounded the Israeli Mossad with a legendary aura. Back in Warsaw, no one suspected Viktor Grajewski of having smuggled Khrushchev's speech to the United States. In January 1957, Victor emigrated to Israel. Grateful Amos Manor helped him get a job in the East European department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Shortly afterward, he was also hired as an editor and reporter in the Polish section of Kol Israel, the state-owned radio network. But soon he also got a third job. Shortly after coming to Israel, he'd met a few Soviet diplomats at an Ulpan, a special school where immigrants and foreigners were taught the Hebrew language. One of the Russian diplomats happened to meet him in a foreign ministry's hallway, and was impressed by the important position held by this new immigrant. Soon afterward, a KGB agent popped up by chance at Grajewski's side on a Tel Aviv street. He conversed with Grajewski and reminded him of his past in Poland as an anti-Nazi and a communist. Then he made him an offer, become a KGB agent in Israel. Grajewski promised to think about it, then made a beeline for Mossad headquarters. "What should I do?" he asked. The Mossad people were delighted. "Wonderful," they said, "go ahead and accept." They would turn Grajewski into a double agent who would feed the Russians false information. So began a new and long career for Victor. For many years, he supplied the Russians with information concocted and doctored by the Mossad. His KGB handlers would meet him in the forests around Jerusalem and Ramleh, in Russian churches and monasteries in Jaffa, Jerusalem, and Tiberias, during chance encounters in crowded restaurants and at diplomatic receptions. Not once, in the 14 years that Grajewski spent as a double agent, did the Soviets suspect that he was the one using them. They complimented him over and over for the excellent materials that he provided. In KGB headquarters in Moscow, rumor had it that the Soviet Union had an agent embedded deep in Israeli governing circles. Through all those years, the Soviets trusted Grajewski and never questioned his credibility. The exception was in 1967, when they ignored him and his conclusions. Ironically, this was the only time when he delivered fully accurate information. During the waiting period in 1967 before the Six-Day War, Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, erroneously believed that Israel intended to attack Syria in May. So he massed his troops in Sinai, expelled the UN peacekeepers, closed the Red Sea Straits to Israeli ships, and threatened Israel with annihilation. Israel had had no intention to attack and was eager to prevent a war with Egypt. Prime Minister Eshkol then asked the Mossad to inform the Soviets that if Egypt didn't cancel its aggressive measures, Israel would have to go to war. He hoped that the Soviet Union, which had a huge influence on Egypt, would stop Nasser. Gruevsky conveyed to the KGB a document detailing Israel's true intentions. But the USSR made a wrong assessment of the situation. Moscow ignored Gruevsky's report and encouraged Nasser in his belligerence. The result was that Israel, in a preemptive attack, destroyed the armies of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan and conquered much of their territory. And the Soviet Union, too, was a great loser. Its weapons were proved inferior, it reneged on its promises, and failed to support its badly beaten allies. Nevertheless, the long-lasting affair between Gruevsky and the KGB reached its peak that year. He was summoned to a meeting with his Soviet handler in a forest in central Israel. The KGB agent solemnly informed him that the Soviet government wanted to thank him for his devoted services and had decided to award him its highest distinction, the Lenin Medal. The Russian apologized for not being able to pin the medal on Gruevsky's lapel in Israel, but assured him that the medal was being kept for him in Moscow, and he would receive it whenever he got there. Gruevsky preferred to stay in Israel. And in 1971 he retired from the spy game. But he was not forgotten. In 2007, he was invited to Shabak headquarters, where he was welcomed by a select group that included present and past directors of Shabak and Mossad, as well as many of his friends, colleagues, and relatives. The Shabak director at the time, Yuval Diskin, presented him with a prestigious award for his distinguished service, and Gruevsky became the only secret agent to be decorated twice, by his own country, which he had served with devotion all his life, and by his country's foe, whom he had misled and deceived, regardless of the risks. A reporter called him the man who began the end of the Soviet Empire, but Gruevsky didn't feel that way. "I am not a hero, and I didn't make history," he said. The one who made history was Khrushchev. "I just met history for a couple of hours, and then our ways parted." He died at the age of 81. And somewhere in the Kremlin, in a little box padded with red velvet, his medal, engraved with the profile of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, perhaps still awaits him. Episode 6. Bring Eachman dead or alive. "And what's your name?" the girl asked. "Nicholas," the smiling suitor said. "But all my friends call me Nick." "Nick Eachman." The blind Jew's daughter. In the late fall of 1957, Issa Horel received a strange message from Frankfurt, Germany. It said that Dr. Fritz Bauer, Attorney General of Hesse, requests to convey some secret information to the Mossad. Issa knew of Bauer, a much respected figure in Germany. A tall, charismatic man with a pugnacious jaw, he was known for aggressively pursuing Nazi criminals. His leonine mane of white hair gave him a vague resemblance to David Ben-Gurion. Bauer, too, was Jewish, and a born fighter. In 1933, with Hitler's ascension to power, he was thrown into a concentration camp. But the horrid experience did not break his spirit. He later escaped to Denmark and then to Sweden. At the end of the war, he decided to devote his life to the pursuit and punishment of Nazi criminals. And he was outspoken about his disappointment with West Germany's authorities, who did little to uproot Nazism. In November 1957, Issa sent Shaul Daram, an Israeli security officer, to meet with Bauer. He arrived in Frankfurt and had a long conversation with the Attorney General. A few days later, Darum walked into Issa's office in Tel Aviv. Dr. Bauer told me, Darum said, that Eichmann is alive, and he is hiding in Argentina. Issa started. Like millions of Jews, he knew SS Colonel Adolf Eichmann as the embodiment of Nazi horror. The Obersturmbannführer Eichmann had personally directed the final solution, the systematic annihilation of European Jewry. He had devoted his life to the meticulous massacre of 6 million Jews. He had disappeared after the war, and nobody knew where he was. He was said to be living in Syria, Egypt, Kuwait, South America. Darum recounted in detail his conversation with Bauer. A few months earlier, Bauer had received a letter from Argentina, sent by a German émigré, half-Jewish, who had suffered under the Nazis during the war. He had read newspaper reports about Bauer's relentless pursuit of Nazi criminals and knew that on top of that list of wanted men was Adolf Eichmann. When his pretty daughter, Sylvia, told him she was dating a young man, Nick Eichmann, he was stunned. He thought that young Nick must be related to the missing mass murderer. He wrote to Bauer that he could lead his agents to Eichmann's hideout. Eichmann was said to live in Buenos Aires under a false identity. Bauer already knew that Eichmann had escaped from Germany after the war. His wife, Vera, and his 3 sons had stayed on in Austria, but a few years later they vanished. Eventually, Bauer found out that they had emigrated to Argentina, where Vera had remarried. Bauer was convinced that she had joined Eichmann and her second marriage was fictitious. Her second husband had to be Eichmann himself, who had been waiting for her. Bauer feared that if he asked the German government to request Eichmann's extradition from Argentina, he'd lose him. He didn't trust the German judicial branch, still full of former Nazis. He also suspected a few employees at the Buenos Aires German embassy. Bauer feared that even before an official extradition demand was handed to the Argentinians, somebody at the embassy or in Germany would warn Eichmann and he'd vanish again. Bauer spoke frankly with Shaul Darum. He wanted the Mossad to find out if this man in Buenos Aires was indeed Eichmann, and, if so, Israel should demand his extradition or launch a covert operation and abduct Eichmann. "I am speaking to you after many days and nights of soul-searching," Bauer admitted. "Only one man in Germany knows about my decision to give you this information, Minister-President of Hesse George August Zinn, a Social Democrat and a future president of Germany's Federal Council, the Bundesrat." Shaul Darum, now back in Israel, put on Issa's desk a single sheet of paper, revealing Eichmann's hideout. Issa's eyes focused on one sentence. 4261, Calle Chacabuco, Olivos, Buenos Aires. In early January 1958, a young man strolled down Calle Chacabuco. This was Emmanuel, Emma, Talmor, a member of Mossad Special Operations. Issa had sent him to check the accuracy of Bauer's message. Emma didn't like what he saw. Olivos was a poor neighborhood, inhabited mostly by laborers. On both sides of the unpaved Calle Chacabuco stood decrepit shacks, including number 4261. In its tiny courtyard, Talmor noticed a fat, shabby woman. "I don't believe that could be Eichmann's house," Talmor said to Issa in his Tel Aviv office a few days later. "I'm certain that Eichmann transferred a ton of money to Argentina, like all the Nazi big shots, who prepared their escapes long before the Reich fell. I can't believe he lives in such a hovel and such a slum. Nor can that fat woman in the courtyard be Vera Eichmann." Talmor's objections didn't convince the Mossad. Issa wanted to continue investigating, but he needed to contact Bauer's source. He got in touch with Bauer, who immediately revealed the name and address of his informant, Lothar Hermann. He had now moved to another town, Coronel Suarez, about 300 miles from Buenos Aires. Bauer sent Issa a letter of introduction, asking Herman to do everything to assist the bearer of the letter. And in February 1958, an overseas visitor came to Coronel Suarez, Ephraim Hofstetter, head of investigation of the Tel Aviv police. He happened to be in Argentina for an Interpol conference and agreed to cooperate with Issa. But, being cautious, when he knocked on the door at Libertad Avenue, he introduced himself as a German, Karl Huppert. In the living room he saw a blind man, plainly dressed, his hands resting on a massive wooden table. As Hofstetter walked in, the blind man heard his footsteps and turned toward him, groping for his hand. This was Lothar Hermann. "I am a friend of Fritz Bauer," Hofstetter said. He hinted that he was connected with Germany's secret service. Hermann told him he was Jewish and had been a policeman until the Nazis took power. His parents had been murdered and he had been sent to Dachau, where he had lost his sight. He later emigrated to Argentina with his German wife. When he stumbled upon the name of Eichmann, he had contacted Bauer. His only motive, he claimed, was to help punish the Nazi criminals who had massacred his family. "You see," he said, touching the arm of his lovely daughter, Sylvia, who had entered. "She is the one who found Eichmann for you." The girl blushed and hesitantly told Hofstetter her story. Until a year and a half ago, she said, her family had lived in the Olivos neighborhood in Buenos Aires. There she'd met Nick Eichmann, a nice young man with whom she had had a few dates. She didn't tell him that she was of Jewish origin, since the Hermanns were known as an Aryan family. But Nick didn't mince his words. He had once remarked to her that the Germans should have finished the job and annihilated all the Jews. And on another occasion he mentioned that his father had served as an officer in the Wehrmacht during World War II and had fulfilled his duty to the fatherland. Nick freely shared his views with Sylvia, but never invited her to his home. Even after her family left Buenos Aires and they exchanged letters, he withheld his home address and had her write to him at a friend's address. This odd behavior triggered Lothar Hermann's suspicions that Nick could be Eichmann's son. He traveled with his daughter to Buenos Aires and took a bus to Olivos. Sylvia, with the help of some friends, found Nick Eichmann's address and even managed to enter the house on Calle Chacabuco. But Nick wasn't home. There she met a balding man who wore spectacles and sported a thin mustache. He told her he was Nick's father. Hermann now told Hofstetter that he would agree to go again to Buenos Aires with Sylvia to help pursue this investigation. Sylvia was needed to accompany her blind father everywhere and to write and read his correspondence. Hofstetter gave him a list of items he needed for the definitive identification of Eichmann: his photograph, present name, workplace, official documents about him, and his fingerprints. Hofstetter and Hermann then established a secure system for corresponding, and Hofstetter gave Hermann some money for expenses. Finally, he took a postcard out of his pocket and tore it in two. He gave one half to Hermann. "If somebody brings to you the other half," he said, "you can tell him everything. He will be one of us." Hofstetter left them, returned to Israel, and reported to Issa. A few months later, Hermann's report arrived at Mossad headquarters. He reported with enthusiasm that he had found out everything about Eichmann. The house on Calle Chacabuco had been built by an Austrian, Francisco Schmidt, 10 years earlier. Schmidt had rented the house to two families, Deguto and Clement. Hermann emphatically claimed that Schmidt was Eichmann. He believed that Deguto and Clement only served as a cover for the real Eichmann. Issa asked his agent in Argentina to verify Hermann's report. The man cabled back, "There is no doubt that Francisco Schmidt is not Eichmann. He does not live and has never lived in the house on Calle Chacabuco." Issa concluded that Herman was not reliable and decided to end the investigation. The mistake. Issa's decision was a huge mistake, and it could have ruined Israel's opportunity to capture Eichmann. One couldn't help but wonder about the incompetence that plagued the early stages of the operation. How could a covert, complex investigation have been entrusted to an elderly, blind, and unskilled man? How could the Mossad have taken seriously his mistaken identification of Eichmann? How could Issa have ignored the fact that Sylvia had visited Calle Chacabuco and met Nick Eichmann's father? Instead of sending to Buenos Aires a professional investigator who could have checked the identities of the two tenants and the landlord, Issa simply walked away. This grave error, in particular, was unlike Issa. A year and a half later, Fritz Bauer came to Israel. He didn't want to meet Issa Horel, whom he blamed for having failed to capture Eichmann. He went and met directly with Attorney General Chaim Cohen in Jerusalem. He let his anger explode when he described to Cohen the lame handling of this investigation by the Mossad. Chaim Cohen summoned Issa and Zvi Aharoni, the Shabak chief investigator, to Jerusalem. Bauer was waiting in his office and accused Horel of botching the investigation. He also threatened that if the Mossad was unable to carry out the mission, he would have no choice but ask the German authorities to take it on. But it was not his threat that persuaded Horel to reopen the case. It was a new piece of information that Bauer had brought with him, two words that appeared to solve the mystery. Eichmann's fictitious name in Argentina, Bauer revealed, was Ricardo Clement. All at once, Issa realized where he had gone wrong and where his men had erred. Eichmann actually was one of the tenants on Calle Chacabuco. Only not Schmidt, it was Clement. Herman's daughter had indeed dated Eichmann's son, and the Eichmann family did live on Calle Chacabuco. But Herman didn't know that Eichmann had changed his name to Clement, and instead had mistakenly pointed him out as Francisco Schmidt. If Issa had done his job and sent skilled agents to investigate Herman's story, he would long ago have discovered Eichmann's true identity. Issa now suggested to Cohen and Bauer that Zvi Aharoni be put in charge of the investigation. Aharoni was a tall, lean man with a clear forehead, a square mustache, and a razor-sharp mind. A German Jew himself, he was personally close to Cohen, but less so with Issa. Aharoni was still angry that, in 1958, when he had come to Buenos Aires on another case, Issa hadn't tasked him with checking out the Herman testimony. But that had to be forgotten. Today Issa badly needed Aharoni's expertise. And so, in February 1960, Aharoni landed in Buenos Aires. He asked a friend, a local Jew, to have a look at the house on Calle Chacabuco. The man came back upset. The house was empty, he reported. A few painters and masons were refurbishing one of the two apartments, in fact, the former flat of the Clements. But they had left, destination unknown. Aharoni now had to devise a way to trace Clement without raising suspicion. In early March, a young Argentinian in a bellboy's uniform came to the house on Calle Chacabuco. He was carrying a small, gift-wrapped package addressed to Nicholas Clement. It contained an expensive lighter and a perfumed card with a short inscription, "Dear Nick, greetings for your birthday." It looked like a birthday present sent by a woman who wanted to remain anonymous. The messenger entered the flat, where a few painters were working, and asked for the Clement family, but most of the workers had no idea who the Clements were. One of the painters, though, told the bellboy he thought they had moved to the San Fernando neighborhood, on the other side of Buenos Aires. He then led the bellboy to a nearby workshop, where Nick Eachman's brother worked. He was a blond man named Dieter, but though his manners were pleasant, he refused to disclose the Clement's new address. Nevertheless, the talkative Dieter told the bellboy that his father was temporarily working in the faraway city of Tucumán. The bellboy returned to Cayo Chacabuco and kept pestering the painters with incessant questions. Finally, he got to a man who vaguely recalled a new address for the Clements. "You should take the train down to San Fernando station," he said. "Then you'll take bus 203 and get off at Avellenda. Across the street you'll see a kiosk. On its right, a bit apart from the other houses, you'll see a small brick house. That's the Clement home." The delighted messenger hurried back and reported to Aharoni. The next day Aharoni took the train to San Fernando, followed the painter's instructions, and found the house at once. At the nearby kiosk he stopped and inquired about the name of the street. Cayo Garibaldi, the old vendor told him. The investigation was back on track. Cayo Garibaldi. In mid-March, Aharoni put on a business suit and headed to a house on Cayo Garibaldi, across the street from the Clement home. "I represent an American company," he said to the woman who opened the door. "We manufacture sewing machines and we are looking to build a factory in this area. We would like to buy your house." And then he added, pointing at the Clement home, "and that house as well. Would you like to sell?" While chatting with the woman, Aharoni kept pressing a button concealed in the handle of a small case he was carrying. It activated a hidden camera that took pictures of the Clement house from various angles. The next day Aharoni checked the city archives, and found that the lot on which the Clement home sat belonged to Ms. Vera Liebelder Eachman, proof that Vera hadn't married again, and, following Argentinian custom, she had registered the deed in both her maiden and married names. Ricardo Clement apparently chose not to be mentioned in official documents. Aharoni returned to Cayo Garibaldi several times, on foot, by private car or small truck, and took photos of the house, Vera, and of the little boy he saw playing in the yard. He did not see Clement, but he decided to wait for a special date, March 21st. Aharoni's file indicated that this would be the 25th wedding anniversary of Adolf Eachman and Vera Liebel. He expected Eachman would return from Tucumán to celebrate this with his family. On March 21st, Aharoni returned there with his camera. In the courtyard, he saw a thin, balding man of average height, with a thin mouth, a big nose, and a mustache. He was wearing spectacles. These features all matched the description in his intelligence file. Eachman. In Israel, Issa drove to Ben-Gurion's house. "We have located Eachman in Argentina," he said. "I think we can capture him and bring him to Israel." Ben-Gurion immediately responded. "Bring him dead or alive," he said. He thought for a moment and added, "It would be better to bring him alive. This will be very important for our youth." The advance team arrives. Issa formed the operational team. All of its 12 members were volunteers. Some were Holocaust survivors, with concentration camp numbers tattooed on their forearms. The core of the team was the operational unit of the security services. At its head were the two top agents of the Shabak. Rafi Eitan was appointed commander. At his side was Zvi Malkin, whom Eitan described as brave, physically strong, and endowed with tactical creativity. A balding man with bushy eyebrows, strong jaw, and deep, melancholy eyes, he was known as the best spy catcher of the Shabak. He never carried a gun. One may be tempted to use it. He relied on common sense, inventiveness, and improvisation, and had unmasked several top Soviet agents. He'd spent some of his childhood in Poland and immigrated with his family to Israel after a bloody pogrom in the village of Granik Lubelski. Only his sister Fruma and her family had stayed behind. All of them and Zvi's other relatives perished in the Holocaust. He grew up in Haifa and fought in the Independence War. Among his many talents were painting, writing compulsively, and acting. During a stay in New York, he had become close with Lee Strasberg, founder of the Actors Studio, and had learned a lot from him about acting. In many of the Mossad operations in which I participated, he later said, I played as if I were on stage, using disguises and makeup. In other operations, I felt as if I was directing a play. I wrote out my operational orders like screenplays. Another team member was Vienna-born Avram Shalom, a stocky, tight-lipped man who was Eiton's deputy and a future Shabak director. Some of the others were Yakov Gat, a discreet Paris-based field operative, Moshe Tava, a former soldier in the British Army and a member of the Secret Avengers group, which hunted Nazi criminals at the end of the war, some of whom he had personally killed, and quiet, self-effacing Shalom Dani, a talented painter and a genius in document forging. Some claimed that he had escaped a Nazi concentration camp by forging an authorization on toilet paper. Most of the men were married, with families. The team was also well composed professionally. Efraim Elani knew Argentina well and was familiar with the streets of Buenos Aires. He was a skilled locksmith, a man of great physical strength, and an agent with a very honest face who could inspire trust in anyone. Yehudith Nisiyahu, a religious woman and the best female agent in the Mossad, also volunteered. Yehudith was quiet, shy, unobtrusive, rather overweight and plain. She was married to a Labour Party activist, Mordecai Nisiyahu. She hosted one of the authors of this book several times, and there was nothing in her behavior that appeared out of the ordinary. Dr. Yona Elian, a physician who had participated in several Mossad operations in the past, would be there to assist in bringing each man back to Israel. Zvi Aharoni, the investigator, also joined. But the first volunteer to join the team was Issa himself. He loved to lead his men in dangerous operations abroad. But this time, he knew that in the course of taking action, immediate decisions at the top level would need to be made. And this could also have far-reaching political consequences. It was therefore crucial that the Israelis be led by someone who could make political decisions if necessary. Issa felt he had to assume command. At the end of April, an advance team of agents entered Argentina from different directions. They smuggled essential equipment into the country. Walkie-talkies, electronic tools and instruments, medical supplies, and also a part of Shalom Dani's ambulant lab, equipped to produce passports, documents, and affidavits. They rented an apartment in Buenos Aires, codenamed The Castle, where several team members would live and work, and stocked it with food. The following day the four rented a car and drove to San Fernando, arriving there at 7:40 p.m. Darkness had fallen and they got a big surprise. While driving slowly on Route 202, they suddenly saw, walking directly toward them, Ricardo Clement. He paid them no attention, simply turned and entered his house. The agents concluded that Clement probably came home every evening at approximately this same time, and his capture could be carried out on the same deserted dark stretch between the bus station and his home. That night, they wired Israel, in code, Operation Feasible. A plane for Abba Eban. Issa felt he was in luck. He learned that on May 20th Argentina would celebrate the 150th anniversary of its independence. High-ranking delegations would be coming from all over the world to participate in the festivities. An Israeli delegation headed by Minister of Education Abba Eban would also come. Abba Eban was happy to learn that El Ul would be putting at his disposal a special plane, a Britannia Whispering Giant. Nobody told Eban that the real reason for El Ul's generosity was Operation Eichmann. Flight 601 to Buenos Aires had been scheduled for May 11th. The plane crew was carefully selected and Issa had revealed the secret only to two of El Ul's senior officials, Mordecai Ben-Ari and Ephraim Ben-Artzi. The pilot, Zvi Tohar, was advised to take a qualified mechanic with him, in case the plane suddenly had to take off without the assistance of an Argentinian land crew. On May 1st, at dawn, Issa landed in Buenos Aires with a European passport. A freezing wind swept the airport runways. In Argentina, it was almost winter. 8 days later, on the evening of May 9th, several Israelis slipped into a tall new apartment building in Buenos Aires. They went up to an apartment that had been rented a few days earlier, codenamed Heights. All members of the operational unit were present. Earlier, they had settled in various hotels around town. The last to enter was Issa. For the first time, the 12 were together. Since coming to Argentina, Issa had established an ingenious mode of communication with his team. In his pocket, he carried a list of 300 cafes in Buenos Aires, with their addresses and their hours of operation. Every morning he would set out on a walking tour, going between these cafes, following an itinerary and a timetable he had designated beforehand. This way his men knew exactly where he could be found at every moment of the day. The one big inconvenience in this system was the gallons of strong Argentinian coffee that the Mossad had to absorb in these daily circuits. From the cafes Issa directed the preparations for the abduction. These were days of feverish activity, bringing and setting up equipment needed for keeping a prisoner, renting cars for surveillance and for the capture, renting additional apartments and secluded villas out of town, where Eichmann would be held. The most important villa, the base, was on the way to the airport. It was rented by two Mossad agents posing as tourists. One of them was Yakov Maidad, Mayo, a stocky, German-born man who had lost his parents in the Holocaust and fought in the British Army during the war. The woman who played the role of his companion was Yehudith Nisiyahu. Within the villa the agents built a hiding place for Eichmann and his guard, if the local police were ever to investigate. A second flat was prepared as an alternative. The plan now was for Eichmann to be captured on May 10th, the plane to arrive on May 11th, and on May 12th, to set off for Israel. But a last-moment change screwed up the plan. Because of the great number of visitors coming for the anniversary celebrations, the protocol Department of the Argentinian Ministry of Foreign Affairs informed the Israeli delegation that they would have to delay their arrival until May 19th, at 2 p.m. For Issa that meant either delaying Eichmann's capture till May 19th, or executing the plan on May 10th and then waiting in hiding with their captive for 9 or 10 days. That could be very risky, especially if, at his family's request, an intensive search was organized for the missing Eichmann. There was a real danger that Eichmann and his Israeli abductors might be found by the police. Despite reservations, Issa decided to move ahead as originally planned, but because of his people's fatigue, he decided to push it back one day. Day was set for May 11th, an H-hour for 7:40 p.m. The operational plan was now laid out and ready in minute detail. Eichmann returned from work every evening at 7:40 p.m. He got off bus 203 at the kiosk and walked home along Calle Garibaldi. The street was dark, traffic was sparse. The operation would be carried out by agents in 2 cars, one team for the abduction, another for security and protection. The first car would be parked at the roadside with its hood raised, and the agents would appear to be repairing it. When each man passed by them, they would jump him, overpower him, and throw him into the car. It would then at once dart forward, with the other car following. The doctor would travel in the second car, to be close by in case the captive needed to be drugged. Issa, in a strict tone, gave precise orders. "If you run into any kind of trouble," he said, "you do not let go of each man even if you're stopped. If the police arrest you, say that you are Israelis, acting on your own, to bring this Nazi criminal to justice. All those who escape arrest," he added, "leave the country according to the current plan." He also instructed my dad and Yehudith Nisiyahu to move into the villa and act like a couple of tourists. Every so often come out and make yourselves comfortable on the lawn with snacks and newspapers. All the other agents were ordered to leave their hotels and move to the designated safe houses. Countdown. May 11th, morning. The operational unit completed its preparations. Even before H-hour, the men had started covering their tracks. Most of the rented vehicles were returned. All members of the group had their disguises in place: makeup, false mustaches, beards, and wigs. Each got new documents that suited their new faces. The 12 who had arrived in Buenos Aires a few days back, who walked the streets, rented cars and apartments, checked into hotels, surveyed the house on Calle Garibaldi, vanished. 12 others, looking different, carrying different documents with different names, took their place. Issa, too, left his hotel, checked his luggage at the railroad station, and returned to the city. Today, as every day, he would keep moving between the cafes. His movements today were in a business and entertainment area, where the cafes were at barely a 5-minute walk from one to the next. 1 p.m., Issa, Rafi Eitan, and a few of the lead operatives met for a final briefing in a big restaurant in the city center. All around them, merry Argentinians laughed, drank, and devoured local grilled meats. At 2 p.m., the team dispersed. 2:30 p.m., in a large midtown parking garage, the agents took the capture car that had been there for a few days and drove it to the base. The second car set off from another garage. 3:30 p.m., the 2 cars were stationed by the base, ready to move. For 30 p.m., last briefing in the base. The operational unit guys changed clothes, took their papers, and prepared to leave. 6:30 p.m., the 2 cars departed. For agents were in the capture car Zvi Aharoni as the driver, Rafi Eitan, the commander, Moshe Tava and Zvi Malkin. 3 more agents were in the second car Avrom Shalom, Yaakov Gat, and Dr. Elian, who carried a case with drugs, instruments, and sedatives. The cars arrived separately and met at a crossroads, not far from the Clement house. The agents checked the area and established that there were no checkpoints or police forces nearby. 7:35 p.m., the 2 cars parked on Calle Garibaldi. Thick darkness had settled over the place already. The capture car, a black Chevrolet sedan, was parked at the sidewalk, turned toward the Clement house. 2 agents got out and raised the hood. Aharoni remained at the wheel, and the 4th man crouched inside the car, watching the spot where each man was expected to emerge from the dark. One of the men put on thin gloves, in case he had to touch each man. The very thought of touching him filled him with disgust. Across the street was the second car, a black Bic. 2 agents got out and busied themselves around the car. The third remained in the driver's seat, ready to turn on his lights and blind Clement as he approached. The trap was set. But Clement didn't show. 7:40 p.m., bus 203 stopped at the corner, but nobody got out. 7:50 p.m., 2 more buses came, one after the other. Clement was in neither. Anxiety swelled through the agents. What had happened? Had he changed his habits? Did he smell danger and flee? 8 p.m. At an earlier briefing, Issa had told the group that if Clement didn't show by 8, they were to abort and leave. Rafi Aton, though, decided to wait until 8:30. 8:05 p.m., another bus stopped at the corner. At first the Israeli saw nothing. But Avram Shalom, who was in the second team, suddenly discerned a silhouette coming along Calle Garibaldi. Clement! He turned on his lights, aiming a blinding beam at the approaching figure. Ricardo Clement was walking toward his house. The dazzling light struck him in the face and he averted his eyes. He kept walking. He noticed a car by the side of the road, probably engine trouble, and a few people beside it. At that moment, a man by the Chevrolet turned to him. "Momentito, senor, just a moment," he said. It was V. Malkin, using the only 2 words he knew in Spanish. Clement reached for the flashlight in his pocket, one he often used in this dark part of the street. Then it all happened with lightning speed. Malkin feared Clement was drawing a gun. He leaped on Clement and threw him on the dirt at the roadside. Clement let out a loud, shrill shout. From the car, another man, and another, sprung on him. Strong arms took hold of his head and covered his mouth. They pulled him into the back of the car and laid him, stunned, on its floor. The driver started the car and it darted forward. Barely half a minute had passed between the moment Clement appeared and the car's departure. Seconds later, the other car took off and followed. Agile hands quickly tied Clement's hands and feet. And somebody stuck a rag in his mouth. His glasses were removed and replaced by opaque black spectacles. A voice barked in German, close to his ear, "One move and you're dead." He obeyed. For the entire trip he didn't budge. Meanwhile, 2 hands slipped under his clothes and felt his skin. Rafi Aton's hands were searching for his scars, one under the left armpit, one on the right side of his belly. Aton looked at Malkin and nodded. They shook hands. Each man was in their grasp. Aton thought he had his feelings under control. But then he suddenly realized that he was humming the song of the Jewish partisans in the war against the Nazis, and repeating the refrain, "We are here. We are here." The car was moving very fast, then suddenly stopped, its engine still running. Clement could not know that it was for a train barrier. The 2 capture cars had to wait long minutes while an endless freight train passed. This felt to the agents like the most critical moment in the entire operation. Their cars were surrounded by other cars, all waiting for the barrier to be raised. Outside voices could be heard, but Clement didn't dare move. None of the Argentinians alongside them noticed anything strange lying on the car's floor. Minutes later, the barrier was raised and the cars all smoothly moved forward. 20:55 p.m., the 2 cars came to a stop in the driveway of the base. Clement, trudging like a blind man between his captors, was ushered into the house. He did not object when the men holding him started undressing him. They demanded in German that he open his mouth. He obeyed. They checked inside it, searching for a poison capsule perhaps lodged between his teeth. Still wearing opaque glasses, he didn't see a thing, but felt hands checking his body again and touching his scars. An expert hand slipped under his left armpit and touched the tiny scar that remained when, a few years ago, he had tried to remove the small tattoo of his blood type, customary among SS officers. Suddenly a voice rang out in German. The size of your hat. Your shoes. Date of birth. Father's name. Mother's name. Like a robot, he answered in German. Even when they asked, "What is the number of your Nazi party card?" "Your number in the SS?" He couldn't stay silent. For 5326 and another number, 63752. Your name? Ricardo Clement. Your name? The voice repeated. He shivered. Otto Henninger. Your name? Adolf Eichmann. A silence settled around him. He broke it. I am Adolf Eichmann, he repeated. I know that I am in the hands of the Israelis. I also know some Hebrew. I studied with a rabbi in Warsaw. He recalled some verses of the Bible and started reciting them, trying to speak the Hebrew words with the proper pronunciation. No one else spoke. The Israeli boys stared at him, stupefied. A messenger to stay Boca. Issa was moving from one cafe to another. It was late at night when he entered another cafe and slumped in a chair facing the door. Suddenly he saw two of his men at the entrance. He jumped up. We got him, Aharoni said, beaming. He's been definitely identified and he's confessed that he is Adolf Eichmann. Issa shook their hands and they left. Now he had to go back to the railroad station, pick up his suitcase, and check into a new hotel under his new identity, as if he had just arrived in Buenos Aires. The night air was cool and crisp and he decided to walk. He had been running a slight fever and suffering from a cold, but now he felt wonderful. He walked, alone in the dark, enjoying the cool night air and feeling uplifted, the kind of intoxication he would never forget. The next day a car stopped by a wooden cabin in Kibbutz Sde Boca. A thin man, wearing glasses, came out of the car, showed his ID to the guards, and entered Ben-Gurion's study. This was Yaakov Karoz, Issa's close aide. Issa sent me, he said. We got a cable from him. Eichmann is in our hands. The old man was silent. Then he asked, when is Issa coming back? I need him. Looking at the distraught faces of his men, Issa realized how Eichmann's very presence in their company was depressing them. The German monster was next to them, now, separated by only a thin wall, and that unnerved these tough people and filled them with disgust. They couldn't get used to looking after a man who, in their eyes, was the symbol of evil, who, for many of them, had been the murderer of their closest relatives, fathers, mothers, brothers, and sisters, all vanished in the crematoriums. And taking care of Eichmann meant tending to his needs 24 hours a day. They couldn't give him a razor, so they shaved him. They couldn't leave him alone for a second, lest he commit suicide. They had to be with him even when he went to the toilet. Yehudith Nisiyahu cooked and served Eichmann's meals, but refused to wash the dishes from which he ate. Her repulsion for him overwhelmed her. Zvi Malkin, sitting in a corner, fought his disgust by drawing sketches of Eachman on an old copy of a guide to South America. The guards, who changed every 24 hours, were totally stressed out, and Issa felt he had to give each of them a day's leave. Let them walk about. Buenos Aires, he thought, taste the bustling life of this big city, and for a few hours forget the obscene reality at the base. These were becoming the 10 longest days of their lives, hiding themselves in a foreign country, and living in fear of a tiny mistake that could trigger a police raid and an international scandal. Planning the escape. Eachman sat in a bare room, with no windows, illuminated day and night by a lone bulb. He was obedient and readily fulfilled his guard's instructions. It seemed as if he had resigned himself to his fate. The only one who spoke with him was Aharoni, who interrogated him about his life prior to his capture. Eachman answered all the questions. He told Aharoni that after Germany's defeat in May 1945, he had assumed the identity of a Luftwaffe private, Adolf Karl Barth. He later posed as a lieutenant in the 22nd Waffen-SS Cavalry Division, Otto Eckmann, and was incarcerated in a POW camp. At the end of that year, when his name was introduced in the Nuremberg trials of the top Nazis, he escaped from the camp. As Otto Henninger, he hid until 1950 in Zell in Lower Saxony, and that same year escaped to Argentina, via Italy, using one of the escape routes of Nazi criminals. 9 years had passed since he disembarked in Argentina, dressed in a white shirt, bow tie, and winter coat, wearing sunglasses and sporting a pencil-thin mustache. He spent for months with friends in the German pension in a Buenos Aires suburb and for more months at the home of a German contact named Rippeler. Only then did he risk moving around alone and left Buenos Aires for Tucumán, a small town about 600 miles away. There he was employed by Capri, a little-known construction company, said to be a cover company whose mission was to supply fugitive Nazis with jobs. On April 4, 1952, Eachman received his Argentinian ID card in the name of Riccardo Clement, born in Bolzano, Italy, unmarried, mechanic by profession. A year before, in early 1951, Eachman, using a false name, had sent a letter to his wife in Austria. He informed her that the uncle of her children, the man she believed dead, actually was alive and well. Vera Liebel immediately recognized his handwriting and told her sons that Uncle Ricardo, their dead father's cousin, had invited them to join him in Argentina. She obtained a legal passport for herself and for her children. The secret Nazi machine kicked into feverish action and took care of blurring and erasing Vera's tracks. When Israeli secret agents finally got their hands on the Vera Liebel file in the Austrian archives, what they found was an empty folder the contents of which had seemingly evaporated. In June 1952, Vera Liebel and her 3 sons, Horst, Dieter, and Klaus, vanished from their home in Austria. In early July, they surfaced briefly in Genoa, and on July 28 they came ashore in Buenos Aires. On August 15, they got off the train in the dusty Tucumán station. Vera Eachman, Moshe Pullman wrote in his book, still carried in her memory the picture of the dashing Nazi officer who looked so impressive in his dress uniform and shining boots. But the man who waited for her on the Tucumán platform was a middle-aged man, modestly dressed, his face pale and wrinkled, his expression depressed and his walk slow. This was her Adolf. Eachman the Terrible had become unrecognizable. He had gotten thin and was balding, his cheeks were sunken and his face had lost the air of arrogance that had been so characteristic of him. He appeared resigned and anxious, only his thin lips still suggested cruelty and malice. In 1953, Capri went bankrupt and Eachman had to search for a job. First he tried opening a laundry in Buenos Aires with 2 other Nazis, then worked on a rabbit farm, and later in a fruit juice cannery. Finally, with the help of another secret Nazi organization, Ricardo Clement was appointed a foreman at the Mercedes-Benz assembly plant in Suarez. By then he had started believing that he would end his life peacefully. Until May 11, 1960. Meanwhile, Eichmann's sons searched for him in hospitals, morgues, and police stations. They turned for help to the fascist Peronist youth organization Tacuera, which joined the search. But Eichmann's sons soon concluded that the Israelis must have captured their father. They then tried but failed to convince the pro-Nazi organizations to take some drastic action, perhaps kidnap the Israeli ambassador and hold him until their father was released, but the Argentinians refused. Issa instructed his men about what to do if the hideout was located by the police. If they raid the base, Issa said, Eichmann should be rushed to the secret chamber that had been prepared inside the house. If the police set out to do a thorough search, Eichmann was to be whisked out of the house by a side exit that had been specifically set for such an emergency. Several agents were to escape with Eichmann, while the others were to do anything possible to hinder the search, despite the risks that might involve. To whoever would be with Eichmann, Issa said, if the police find the hideout and break in, handcuff yourself to him and throw away the keys, so they won't be able to tear you away from him. Tell them that you're Israeli, and together with your friends you have captured the world's most hated criminal, Adolf Eichmann, in order to bring him to trial. Then give the police my real name, Issa Horel, as well as my false identity, and the name of the hotel where I am staying. If they get hold of you and of Eichmann, I'm to be arrested as well. A few days later, Eichmann agreed to sign a document, stipulating that he was willing to be taken to Israel and put on trial there. It read, I, the undersigned Adolf Eichmann, of my own free will hereby declare, now that my real identity has been discovered, I recognize that there is no further use in trying to evade the course of justice. I agree to be taken to Israel and stand trial before a qualified tribunal. It is understood that I shall be given the assistance of an advocate and that I shall be permitted to lay before the court, without travesty of the facts, an account of the last years of my service in Germany, so that a truthful description of those events may be passed on to the future generations. I am making this declaration of my own accord. Nothing has been promised to me, and I have not been threatened. My desire is to find inner peace at last. As I am unable to remember all the details, and may become confused when stating the facts, I ask that the relevant documents and testimonies be placed at my disposal to help me in my efforts to establish the truth. Adolf Eichmann, Buenos Aires, May 1960. This declaration, of course, had no legal validity. The plane arrives. May 18, 1960, 11 a.m. A formal ceremony took place at Lod International Airport near Tel Aviv. Many high-ranking personalities, including the Chief of Staff General Laskov, the Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Argentinian ambassador to Israel, came to see off the impressive delegation to Argentina for the 150th anniversary celebration. The El Whispering Giant took off, also carrying some regular passengers, bound for stopovers along the way. Few of the passengers noticed that in Rome 3 more civilians came aboard. After a couple of hours, these new passengers had become El crew members and were moving in the aisles in El uniforms. Actually, they were Mossad agents en route to assist their colleagues in Buenos Aires. One of them was Yehuda Carmel, a bald fellow with a prominent nose and a thin mustache. He was not very happy about this trip. He knew he had been chosen not because of his talents, but because of his outward appearance. A few days earlier he had been called to his boss's office, where he saw 2 photos on the desk, his own and one of an unknown man. They looked very similar. When he was told that the unknown man was Adolf Eichmann, he shuddered. He was even more shocked when he was told that he had been chosen to serve as Eichmann's double. Issa's plan was to bring Carmel to Argentina as an LL crew member, to take his uniform and documents, and then use these to get a drugged Eichmann on the plane. Carmel carried an Israeli passport in the name of Zeev Zikroni. Issa had also prepared a backup plan. He summoned, with the help of a go-between, a young kibbutz member, May Barhan, who was visiting relatives in Buenos Aires. May was asked to come to Bar Gloria on Bartolomé Mitre Avenue, where 2 men were waiting for him, Issa and Dr. Elian. Issa instructed him, when you return to your relative's home, call a doctor and tell him that you were in a car accident and that you suffer from dizziness, nausea, and general weakness. The doctor will likely conclude that you suffer from a concussion and will put you in a hospital. On May 19th, in the morning, you'll tell him that you feel much better and you'll ask to go home. You'll be discharged and the hospital will provide you with a document certifying you have been treated for a concussion. Dr. Elian then briefed May on the specific concussion symptoms that he should present. May left Bar Gloria and followed Issa's instructions. He lay there and moaned for 3 days in a big Buenos Aires hospital. On May 19th, he was discharged. An hour later, Issa held in his hands an official hospital document issued to May Barhan, certifying that he had been discharged after being hurt in a car accident. So, if the plan to smuggle Eichmann out of Argentina as an LL crew member were to fail, Issa would have him put on a stretcher and carried to the plane as May Barhan, a patient still suffering from a serious concussion. May 19th. That afternoon the LL plane landed in Buenos Aires. Protocol officials from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, enthusiastic local Jews, and children carrying little blue and white flags stood on both sides of the red carpet laid by the gangway. A couple of hours later, Issa conferred with the pilot, Zvi Tohar, and an LL executive and fixed the takeoff time, May 20th, at midnight. Issa presented his plans. After a short discussion, they agreed to go for Plan A. Eichmann would be brought aboard as a crew member who had been taken ill. His double, Yehuda Carmel, had already turned over his uniform and documents in the name of Zeev Zikroni, an LL navigator, to the Mossad team. Shalom Dani, the team's master forger, doctored the documents so as to fit Eichmann perfectly. Carmel was given new documents and told that he would leave Argentina sometime soon. That evening a beehive of activity took over the base. After a week of strained waiting, the Mossad agent sprang back to life. Eichmann was drugged and fell asleep. The agents meticulously stripped the house. The various instruments and devices were all disassembled, the personal effects packed, and the house fully restored to its previous state. By the wee hours nothing remained that could even hint at the role the villa had played in the last 8 days. And similar actions took place in all the other safe houses. May 20th. Issa left his hotel for the last time, hailed a cab to the railroad station, and checked his luggage. Then he resumed his cafe routine of the previous days. The LL people were the first to report to him, and together they prepared a detailed timetable. At midday the last stage began. Issa paid his check at the final cafe he visited, picked up his luggage, and drove to the airport to oversee the escape operation. He walked through the terminal, looking for a place where he could best set up his command post. He wandered through the shopping and ticketing areas, and finally discovered the cafeteria for airport employees. Outside it was bitterly cold and the cafeteria teemed with clerks, ground crew, and flight personnel, who all came in for a hot drink or a light meal. Issa was delighted. This was ideal. Nobody would notice him or become aware of his hurried and hushed consultations with his men. Issa waited until a chair was vacated, and from it he now began to supervise the final moves on Argentinian soil. Hi, LL. 9 p.m. In the safe house, all was ready. Each man was washed, shaved, dressed in an LL uniform, and had in his pocket an ID in the name of ZEV Zacroni. His face was so well made up that even his own son wouldn't have recognized him. The doctor and 2 agents were also in LL uniforms. The doctor injected each man with a drug that didn't put him to sleep but only blurred his senses. He was able to hear and see and even walk, but he couldn't speak and didn't quite understand what was happening. Aharoni, also wearing an LL uniform, took the wheel of the car, and an agent sat beside him. Each man was put in the back seat, between the doctor and another Mossad agent. The car set out. At the same time 2 other cars departed from a popular hotel in the city center. These cars carried the real LL crew. Their trip to the airport was meticulously synchronized with the progress of the Mossad vehicles. In his improvised command post, Issa received minute-by-minute updates. He ordered his men's baggage to be brought to the airport. He had prepared individual escape routes for each one, but if the main plan proceeded smoothly, they would all leave Argentina on the LL aircraft. Not far from Issa, Shalom Danny was sipping from a steaming mug of black coffee. Passers-by had no idea that this customer had a lot of cheek. He had set up his forgery lab under their very eyes, and was busy doctoring the passports of the Mossad agents, putting in all the necessary stamps and inscriptions to allow for their easy departure. 11 p.m. A man materialized next to Issa. All the cars, Mossad, and LL had arrived, he reported. Issa hurried to the parking lot and checked the LL cars. The crew members were silent. They sensed that they were participating in something extraordinary, but had no idea what it was. They listened to Issa's instructions quietly and asked no questions. Issa peeked into the 3rd car, where each man was dozing between his escorts. "Go," he said. "Good luck." The 3 cars moved ahead, while Issa returned to the terminal. The little convoy reached the Argentinian Airlines barrier. The Israeli aircraft was parked in their lot. "Hi, LL," one of the Israelis merrily called. The guards recognized him and were, in fact, used to the Israelis going in and out of their lot all day. They cast a weary look at the passengers in the 3 vehicles, all dressed in LL uniforms. In 2 of the cars, the passengers were singing, laughing, and loudly chatting, while those in the 3rd car were asleep in their seats. The barrier was raised and all 3 cars drove toward the plane. Their doors opened and the dozen or so uniformed men moved in a cluster toward the gangway. Each man trudged in their middle, largely concealed by the others. 2 men helped him up the stairs, and placed him by a window in 1st class. The doctor and the security team spread out on the seats around him and pretended to be asleep. If Argentinian immigration officers were to come and check their papers, they were to be told that these are the men who work the 2nd shift and need to rest before the next leg of the flight. 11:15 p.m. Issa, back in his seat at the cafeteria, heard the characteristic rumbling of the whispering giant engines. The plane taxied to the terminal and stopped at its departure gate. Issa walked swiftly to the departure hall and looked around. In odd corners he saw his men, standing beside their luggage. Issa walked around to them, and as he approached each of the agents, he whispered, "Get on the plane." They moved casually and joined the line to passport control. All had their passports ready, and Shalom Danny had done a fine job with them. 11:45 p.m. Having passed immigration and customs without any problems, the group went through the departure gate and walked toward the plane. Issa was the last to pick up his luggage, go through the checkpoints, and get on the plane, which almost immediately moved out to the runway. Midnight hours, the night between May the 20th and 21st. The plane stopped. A delay was ordered by the control tower. The agents were all tense with anxiety. Had something happened? Had a last-minute tip reached the Argentinian police? Would they be ordered to turn back? But after a few minutes of terrifying anxiety, the plane was finally cleared. That whispering giant took off over the silvery waters of Rio de la Plata. Issa breathed a sigh of relief. I have to inform the Knesset. May 22nd. The plane landed at Lod Airport early in the morning. At 9:50 a.m. Issa came directly to Jerusalem. Ben-Gurion's secretary, Yitzhak Navin, immediately ushered him into the Prime Minister's office. Ben-Gurion was surprised. When did you arrive? 2 hours ago. We got Eichmann. Where is he? The old man asked. Here, in Israel. Adolf Eichmann is in Israel, and if you agree, we'll deliver him to the police right away. Ben-Gurion fell silent. He didn't burst into tears, as some journalists later reported, nor did he laugh triumphantly, as others wrote. He didn't hug Issa, or show any emotion. Are you sure that this is Eichmann? He asked. How did you identify him? Issa, surprised, answered yes. He detailed for Ben-Gurion all the criteria by which Eichmann had been identified, and stressed that the prisoner himself had admitted that he was Adolf Eichmann. But the old man was not entirely satisfied. Not enough, he said. Before he would authorize any further steps, he wanted 1 or 2 people who had known Eichmann to meet him and formally identify him. He needed to be 100% sure, and he wouldn't say a word about this to his government until then. Issa called his office and ordered his staff to find some people who could identify Eichmann personally. In no time, they located 2 Israelis who in the past had met Eichmann. They were brought to the cell where he was being held, spoke with him, and formally identified him. At midday, an Israeli envoy burst into a restaurant in Frankfurt and rushed to one of the tables, where a white-haired man, visibly nervous and tense, sat alone. Herr Bauer, he said, Adolf Eichmann is now in our hands. Our men have captured him and brought him to Israel. At any moment we can expect a statement in the Knesset by the Prime Minister. Bauer, pale and deeply moved, got up. His hands were trembling. The man who had given the Mossad Eichmann's address in Argentina, the man without whom Eichmann would likely have never been caught, couldn't restrain himself anymore. He burst into tears, grasped the Israeli's shoulder, hugged him, and kissed him. 4 p.m., at the Knesset plenary session, Ben-Gurion got on the speaker's podium. In a firm, clear voice, he read a short statement. I have to inform the Knesset that the security services of Israel have just recently laid hands on one of the greatest of Nazi criminals, Adolf Eichmann, who was responsible with other Nazi leaders for what they called the final solution, that is to say the extermination of 6 million European Jews. Eichmann is at present under arrest here in Israel. he will soon be put on trial in Israel, in accordance with the law on the crimes of the Nazis and their collaborators. Ben-Gurion's words were received with shock and wonder, which turned into huge, spontaneous applause. Amazement and admiration spread through the Knesset and throughout the world. At the end of the Knesset session, a man got up from his seat, behind the government bench. Few knew his face or his name. It was Issa Horel. The trial of Adolf Eichmann opened in Jerusalem on April 11, 1961. 110 Holocaust survivors were the witnesses for the prosecution. Some had never before spoken of their past, and now told their horrendous stories. It was as if the entire state of Israel was glued to the radio and followed with great pain and horror the dreadful story that emerged from the testimonies. And it felt as if the entire Jewish people identified with the prosecutor, Gideon Hausner, who confronted the Nazi criminal as the representative of his 6 million victims. On December 15, 1961, Eichmann was sentenced to death. His appeal was rejected by the Supreme Court, and pardon was refused by President Yitzhak Ben-Zvi. On May 31, 1962, Adolf Eichmann was informed that his end was imminent. In his cell, the condemned man wrote a few letters to his family and drank half a bottle of red caramel wine. Toward midnight, the Reverend Hull, a nonconformist minister, entered Eichmann's cell, as he had on previous occasions. "Tonight I shall not discuss the Bible with you," Eichmann said to him. "I have no time to lose." The minister left, but then an unexpected visitor walked into Eichmann's cell. Rafi Eitan. The abductor stood facing the condemned man, dressed in a prisoner's light brown uniform. Eitan said nothing. Eichmann looked at him and said in German, "I hope that your turn will come after mine." The guards led Eichmann to a tiny room that had been converted to an execution chamber. He was placed on a trapdoor, and a noose was slipped over his neck. A small group of officials, journalists, and a doctor, all allowed to be present at the execution, heard his last words, spoken in the Nazi tradition. "We'll meet again. I have lived, believing in God. I obeyed the laws of war and was loyal to my flag." Two police officers behind a screen simultaneously pressed two buttons, only one of which worked the trapdoor. Neither knew who had the controlling button, so the name of Eichmann's executioner remains unknown. Eitan didn't see the actual execution, but heard the thud of the trapdoor. Eichmann's body was incinerated in an aluminum oven in the prison courtyard. "Black smoke rose toward the sky," wrote an American reporter. No one said a word, but it was impossible not to recall the crematoriums at Auschwitz. Shortly before dawn on June 1, 1962, a swift boat of Israel's Coast Guard passed beyond Israel's territorial waters. The engine was turned off, and while the boat drifted silently, a police officer cast Eichmann's ashes into the Mediterranean. The wind and the waves dispersed the remains of the man who 20 years earlier had merrily declared, "I'll jump laughing into the grave, happy at having exterminated 6 million Jews." At the deathbed of his mother, Zvi Malkin thought of his massacred relatives, of his sister Fruma and her small children, perished in the Holocaust. He bent toward his mother and whispered to her, "Mother, I got Eichmann. Fruma is avenged." "I knew you wouldn't forget your sister," the dying woman whispered. Did you enjoy learning something new today? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more fascinating knowledge. Your support helps us continue bringing you engaging content. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.